Hey everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel where I like to analyze some of the most important or perhaps not so important philosophical ideas of some very interesting philosophers. In case you enjoy learning about these ideas as well and want to see how they can be applied to our modern lives, then you've come to the right place. In today's video I will be discussing the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, most notably from his book The World as Will and ID. Previously, I've made a video listing the top 5 scariest philosophers of all time, and Arthur Schopenhauer, with his unique, elaborated but rather scary philosophy, earned a place on this list as well. In this video, I will elaborate on the interesting but equally frightening philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. In his book The World as Will and ID, Arthur Schopenhauer explained his philosophy. So according to Schopenhauer, the world that we observe exists only in our brains, meaning that the objective world is created through our subjective world. Schopenhauer believed that this is the most definite and simplest truth. He wrote, "For that the objective existence of things is conditioned by a subject whose ideas they are, and consequently that the objective world exists only as an idea, is no hypothesis and still as a dogma, or even a paradox proposed for the sake of discussion. It is the most certain and the simplest truth." Schopenhauer even questioned whether the world would exist if there were no subjects to perceive it, because as far as we can tell, according to Schopenhauer, the world exists only in our brains. As a result, he wrote, "For this perceptible and real world is clearly a phenomenon of the brain. Hence there is a contradiction in the assumption that as such it ought also to exist independently of all brains." Schopenhauer believed that this resulted in an interesting relationship between the subject, which are our brains, and the object, which is the world. So Schopenhauer, he even created a hypothetical dialogue between our brain and the world, wherein they both argue who is more important. In this dialogue, the brain argues that the world is entirely its own idea and exists only through this idea. So the brain would say, "I am, and besides me there is nothing, for the world is my idea." The world would then, however, argue, according to Schopenhauer, that the brain is merely a part of this world, even a part that exists solely because of some accident. "I am, and besides me there is nothing, for the world is my fleeting form. You are merely the sum of a part of this form and entirely accidental." And then after arguing back and forth for a while, the brain and the world would come to the conclusion, according to Schopenhauer, that they both depend upon each other for their existence. So on the one hand, without the brain and therefore without consciousness, the world would not exist because there would be no subject to perceive it. On the other hand, without the world, the brain would not exist because there would be nothing for the brain to perceive. An important question then, however, remains, according to Schopenhauer: what is the origin of the existence of the object and the subject? So Arthur Schopenhauer believed that the answers that had been given up until the point of his philosophy were insufficient. He wrote that the most complete aetiological explanation of the whole of nature can never be more than an inventory of forces which cannot be explained. Schopenhauer indicated that it is not sufficient for us to merely know that we have ideas about the world, we also need to know where these ideas come from. And Schopenhauer, he believed that in order to find the origins of these ideas, we must look inward. He wrote that however much we investigate, we can never reach anything but images and names. We are like a man who goes round a castle, in vain seeking an entrance and sometimes sketching the external walls. And yet, this is the path taken by all the philosophers before me. Schopenhauer believed that if we analyze the forces manifesting themselves within our own walls, we will conclude that these forces are a manifestation of our will. He wrote that the subject of knowledge in his phenomenal existence as an individual is given the answer to the riddle, and the answer is will. This and this alone gives him the key to his phenomenal existence. This reveals the meaning, shows him the inner working of his being, of his behavior, of his movements. This will, according to Schopenhauer, is not something that only manifests itself in man. Instead, every phenomenon occurring in nature, including the growing of plants, the creation of crystals, and the force of gravity, is a manifestation of will. Fundamentally, Schopenhauer believed that the events which would usually be described as a manifestation of force should be described as a manifestation of will. Therefore, he wrote, the concept of will has hitherto commonly been subordinated to that of force, but I do the very opposite, and desire that every force in nature should be thought of as will. In this sense, will is the essential ingredient of every observable and non-observable phenomenon. It underlies every imaginable activity, development, and movement. Schopenhauer even claimed that we humans are merely a phenomenon of will. He argued that we fail to see that the individual, the person, is not will as a thing in itself, but is a phenomenon of will, and as such is already determined and has entered into the form of the phenomenal, the principle of sufficient reason. I've previously made a video on Carl Jung's observation on free will, and whereas Carl Jung observed that we might not possess free will because of a multitude of unconscious forces playing a role in our conscious decision-making process, Schopenhauer argued that we do not possess free will because all our actions are merely a phenomenon of will and subject to will. For example, consciousness, according to Schopenhauer, is necessary for the search for food, and as such it is used by the will as a tool to preserve the species. Schopenhauer believed that this also explains why consciousness does not develop until birth. As a result, he wrote, from the point, therefore, at which the animal has freed itself from the egg or the womb, in which it has vegetated without consciousness, its food must be sought and selected, thus movement following upon motives. And for its sake, consciousness becomes necessary, and so it enters upon the scene as a mechanical aid, needed at this stage of the will's objectification for the preservation of the individual and the propagation of the species. In this sense, our consciousness and our brains would only be a mechanical aid which is necessary for our survival. According to Schopenhauer, knowledge is equally a means used by the will to maintain an individual. Any knowledge, rational as well as merely perceptual, proceeds originally from the will itself, a means of supporting the individual and the species, just as much as any other organ of the body. So this would also explain why we continue to strive for more knowledge. And if will is indeed a sort of force moving organisms, including humans, in a certain direction, then one might wonder whether it will ever reach its goal and stop willing. Schopenhauer believed, however, that this was not the case, and that the will always continue to will. Schopenhauer also argued that a wish or a desire, once it is fulfilled, will quickly result in a new wish or desire. And Schopenhauer argued therefore that happiness is characterized by the speed and frequency in which this circle is completed and restarted again. He wrote that we consider ourselves fairly fortunate if there is still something to wish for and to strive after, to keep up the game whereby desire constantly passes into satisfaction and satisfaction into new desire. If the pace of this is swift, it is called happiness, and if it is slow, sorrow, and does not falter and come to the standstill that shows in dreadful, stultifying boredom, a lifeless yearning without a definite object, a deadening languor. So yeah, after watching this video, you might come to the conclusion that Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy was not the most encouraging. In fact, it is almost a bit depressing. Schopenhauer believed that the world exists only as an idea within our brains, and that all that we do in this world, together with all the other existing organisms, is merely fueled by an unsatisfiable will. Schopenhauer, however, also believed that there was a way for us to free ourselves from our servitude to will. He wrote that how an individual people's knowledge can elude the servitude, throw off its yoke, and free from all the will's purposes, exists purely for itself, simply as a clear mirror of the world. In a future video, I will elaborate on how Schopenhauer believed that we could transcend our will. If you do not want to miss this more positive discussion on the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, then please also subscribe to this YouTube channel. Please also let me know what you thought about the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. If you have any questions, then please do not hesitate to ask them as well. And I want to thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next video as well.